Long before parliaments or courthouses existed, justice was not handed down by robed judges, but whispered through stories told under starlit skies, where the fate of entire communities rested not on written statutes, but on the invisible threads of myth and belief. Imagine a world where the law was not a dry set of rules, but a living, breathing tapestry woven from tales of gods and monsters, where fear and awe were not just fleeting emotions, but meticulously crafted instruments of order and control. This was the reality for our ancient ancestors, a reality where the line between legend and legislation blurred into one powerful force designed to shape human behavior at its very core. Civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece understood something profound about human nature, that stories stick where statutes sometimes slip, and that emotion can anchor ethics more deeply than any edict carved in stone. In these myth-based legal systems, leaders and priests became architects of feeling, engineering responses of dread and wonder to maintain social harmony and enforce communal values. They didn't just threaten punishment, they wove narratives so vivid and gripping that listeners could almost feel the heat of divine wrath or the chill of supernatural judgment. Through epic poems, sacred rituals, and public performances, they embedded legal principles into the collective consciousness, making obedience feel less like compliance and more like participation in something greater, a cosmic drama where every individual played a part. This was emotional engineering at its most sophisticated, turning abstract concepts like justice, duty, and order into visceral experiences that resonated in the heart long before they were processed by the mind. What's truly fascinating is how these ancient strategies still echo in our modern world, from the symbolic scales of justice in courtrooms to the awe-inspiring language used in constitutional ceremonies. In this video, we'll journey back to those early societies to uncover how they masterfully blended mythology with jurisprudence, using divine tales to instill reverence and dread in the hearts of their people. We'll explore the psychological mechanisms behind this timeless approach, revealing why stories of gods judging mortals and cosmic balance continue to shape our understanding of law and ethics today. So settle in and open your imagination, because we're about to step into a realm where stories held the power of life and death, and where the emotional foundations of justice were laid down for millennia to come. To truly grasp the power of these ancient systems, we need to step back in time to a world without written statutes or centralized police forces, a world where a community's survival depended on a shared understanding of right and wrong. This understanding wasn't found in law libraries but around campfires, in temple courtyards, and in the oral histories passed from elder to child. The very first legal codes were not written on parchment but etched into the human psyche through powerful, memorable stories. These narratives answered fundamental questions that plagued early human consciousness. Why should we be good? What happens if we are not? And who gets to decide? Myths provided the answers, wrapping legal principles in the compelling guise of divine drama and cosmic order. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians gave us one of the earliest examples with the Code of Hammurabi, dating back over 4,000 years. This wasn't just a list of penalties, it was a sacred text presented as a direct decree from the gods. The king was not the author of the laws but merely the chosen vessel, the intermediary receiving divine wisdom to establish justice in the land. This framing was a masterstroke of emotional engineering. It transformed the law from a human invention, which could be debated or resisted, into an unassailable element of the universe itself. To break a law wasn't just to disobey a ruler, it was to disrupt the divine harmony bestowed upon humanity, an act that invited chaos and guaranteed retribution from forces far beyond any mortal power. A parallel concept flourished along the Nile, where the Egyptian principle of Mat governed every aspect of life and law. Mat was far more than a rulebook. It was the fundamental order of the cosmos: truth, justice, balance, and harmony, all woven into one. Personified as a goddess with an ostrich feather, she represented the ideal state of existence. The pharaoh's primary duty was to uphold Mat, to be her living embodiment on earth. For every Egyptian, from the highest official to the simplest farmer, living in accordance with Mat was the ultimate goal. This wasn't about fear of a specific punishment, though that existed, but about a profound awe for the beautiful, delicate balance of the universe. A wrongful act wasn't just a crime. It was a lie, a stain of chaos, an offense against the very fabric of reality that everyone had a sacred duty to maintain. What unified these early systems was their genius in making the abstract tangible. You can't hold justice in your hand, but you can fear the wrath of a storm god like Zeus or Enlil. You can't see cosmic order, but you can be awestruck by the perfect, predictable journey of the sun god Ra across the sky. Myths gave a face and a story to these complex ideas, turning them into something people could relate to on a deeply emotional level. The law became intertwined with identity and belief, embedded into the very stories that defined what it meant to be part of a culture. This storytelling approach ensured compliance not through constant surveillance but through a powerful, internalized moral compass, calibrated by generations of evocative narrative. The origins of law, therefore, are not found in cold logic but in the warm, beating heart of human storytelling, where fear and awe were the first and most effective teachers of justice. Now consider how this primal force was channeled into the very stories that defined a society's understanding of right and wrong. Ancient lawmakers understood something profound about human psychology. The fear of a tangible, gruesome, and vividly described consequence is infinitely more powerful than the abstract threat of a fine or a short imprisonment. They weren't just prohibiting actions. They were building psychological fortifications against them, using narrative to make the potential cost of transgression feel horrifyingly real and utterly inescapable. This wasn't about a momentary scare. It was about embedding a deep, lingering dread into the cultural psyche, a dread that would activate automatically at the mere thought of breaking a taboo. Greek mythology offers some of the most stark and memorable examples of this principle in action. The eternal torments of figures like Sisyphus and Tantalus were not just fantastical stories for entertainment. They were essential components of the legal and moral education for every Greek citizen. Sisyphus, the cunning king who cheated death not once but twice, was condemned to an eternity of futile labor, forever pushing a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down just as he neared the summit. This image served as a powerful deterrent against hubris, deceit, and the arrogant belief that one could outsmart the natural or divine order. It taught that certain offenses carried a punishment worse than death, a punishment of pointless, endless, and soul-crushing repetition. Similarly, the story of Tantalus, who was punished by being placed in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree with the branches forever eluding his grasp and the water receding whenever he tried to drink, was a masterclass in psychological torture. His fate was a visceral lesson about the consequences of violating the sacred laws of hospitality and committing atrocities against one's own family. These myths were repeated at gatherings, depicted on pottery, and woven into the fabric of daily life. They made the concept of divine retribution tangible. A citizen didn't need to be told that betraying a guest was illegal. They simply remembered the agonizing fate of Tantalus, and that memory alone was enough to enforce compliance. This engineering of fear tapped directly into humanity's most fundamental anxieties: the fear of pain, the fear of endless suffering, and the ultimate fear of the unknown that comes with death. By painting detailed pictures of the underworld, a realm of judgment presided over by stern gods like Hades, Anubis, or Osiris, these legal systems extended their authority beyond the grave. Your actions in this life would not be forgotten. They would be weighed and measured, determining an eternity of bliss or agony. This made the laws feel omnipresent and eternal. A crime committed in secret was never truly secret. It was always witnessed by the divine, and the punishment, though delayed, was absolutely guaranteed. This removed any temptation that might come from the belief that one could simply get away with it. The effectiveness of this strategy lay in its ability to make the deterrent feel personal and immediate. It wasn't about a distant king's decree, it was about your own soul, your own eternal fate. This transformed legal obedience from a public performance, something you did only when others were watching, into a matter of personal, private survival. You followed the rules not because you might get caught by a guard, but because you genuinely believed that wrongdoing would unravel your very being in the afterlife. By weaving fear so intricately into their foundational stories, these ancient cultures built a self-regulating society where the most powerful enforcer of the law was not a soldier with a spear, but the terrifying, awe-inspiring stories living rent-free in the mind of every single person. Yet if fear was the stick that kept societies in line, awe was the radiant, irresistible carrot that made people want to follow. This profound sense of wonder was the emotional glue that transformed a group of individuals bound by rules into a community united by a shared, sacred purpose. Awe didn't just demand obedience, it invited participation in something magnificent, something far greater than any single person. Where fear made you look down at the potential consequences of your actions, or made you look up to the heavens, to the cosmic order, to the breathtaking majesty of the gods and the universe they governed. This emotional experience connected the mundane act of following a law to the sublime experience of being part of a grand, eternal design. Ancient India provides a masterful case study in this principle with the laws of Manu, a foundational text of Hindu law and society. This wasn't presented as a document drafted by a committee of wise men. It was a smriti, a text remembered and revealed, said to have been breathed into existence by the creator god Brahma himself. Imagine the psychological impact of that framing. These weren't merely regulations about property, marriage, or duty. They were the very thoughts of the divine architect of the universe, the original blueprint for human existence. To learn these laws was to peer into the mind of creation, to understand your designated role within a cosmic play of unimaginable scale and complexity. This instilled a deep, reverential awe that made legal and social adherence feel less like a chore and more like a sacred honor, a way to harmonize your own life with the rhythm of the cosmos itself. This sense of awe was meticulously cultivated through the narratives themselves. Myths weren't just about punishment, they were spectacles of divine power and benevolence. People heard tales of Vishnu sleeping on the cosmic serpent in the Milky Ocean, of Shiva's powerful dance that simultaneously sustained and dissolved the universe, of miracles and divine interventions that affirmed a world of meaning and order. These stories were designed to evoke a feeling psychologists now call vastness, the humbling recognition of being in the presence of something immense that transcends your current understanding of the world. This emotion is incredibly effective at promoting social cohesion. When individuals collectively experience awe, their personal concerns seem to shrink, and a powerful sense of connection to the group and its shared beliefs emerges. You feel part of a we, not just an I. This collective awe directly fostered loyalty to the entire system and its earthly representatives. If the king or priest was understood to be the chosen agent of these awe-inspiring gods, then loyalty to them was an extension of your devotion to the divine order. Questioning their authority wasn't just dissent, it was a failure of vision, an inability to see the grand design of which they were a crucial part. This transformed the legal framework from a top-down imposition of power into a bottom-up expression of shared identity and wonder. Following the law became a way to express your membership in this awe-inspiring narrative, to play your part correctly in the story your culture told about itself and its place in the cosmos. Your everyday actions, how you traded, how you raised your family, how you resolved disputes, were no longer just practical matters. They were small but vital contributions to maintaining the beautiful, awe-inspiring balance of the universe, a privilege granted to you by the gods themselves. But these powerful emotions of fear and awe needed a face, a form that people could recognize and remember, and that's exactly where the gods themselves stepped in, not as distant creators but as active, watchful enforcers of the law. In the pantheons of ancient civilizations, specific deities were assigned the solemn duty of upholding justice, serving as the ultimate judges whose authority no mortal could question or escape. They transformed the abstract idea of the law into something you could almost picture sitting on a celestial throne, listening to the pleas of humanity. Take Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, for example. He wasn't just a powerful figure hurling thunderbolts in fits of anger. He was specifically the guardian of oaths and hospitality, the divine witness to any sworn agreement or the treatment of a guest. To break an oath or harm a visitor was to invite his direct and famously severe retribution. This made every promise feel weighty, every social contract feel sacred, because it was under the watchful eye of a god who could not be deceived. In Mesopotamia, the sun god Shamash played a similarly critical role. As the god of justice, he was depicted in the famous stele of Hammurabi's Code, not as a remote figure but as an active participant, personally handing the laws to the king. This imagery was profoundly intentional. The sun sees everything, nothing escapes its light. Shamash, therefore, was the all-seeing judge, the divine force who illuminated truth and exposed wrongdoing. His association with the sun meant that his judgment was as constant and inevitable as the dawn. You couldn't hide your crimes in the shadows because the light of Shamash would eventually find you. This personification made the concept of universal justice incredibly tangible. It wasn't a hopeful idea. It was a daily reality, as present as the sun rising in the sky, reminding everyone that their actions were always visible to a higher authority. These divine enforcers were never portrayed as vague spirits. They were given distinct, memorable symbols that reinforced their power and purpose. Zeus wielded his thunderbolt, an instantly recognizable instrument of sudden, decisive power. The Egyptian goddess Mat was symbolized by a single ostrich feather, a deceptively simple image that represented the perfect balance and truth against which every human heart would be weighed. Themis, the Greek Titaness of divine law and order, was often shown blindfolded and holding scales, an early embodiment of impartial justice that would later evolve into our modern Lady Justice. These symbols acted as a kind of divine branding, making complex legal principles instantly understandable even to those who couldn't read. A person seeing a depiction of Themis with her scales didn't need a lengthy explanation. They immediately understood the core ideas of fairness, balance, and the measured distribution of consequences. This practice of personification was a stroke of genius in legal storytelling. A list of rules can be forgotten or ignored, but a story about a powerful, emotionally complex god is unforgettable. Myths gave these divine judges personalities, motivations, and even flaws, making them relatable and their lessons sticky. People remembered the story of Zeus transforming Lycaon into a wolf for the crime of serving human flesh, or of Shamash guiding a righteous king to a fair verdict. These narratives packaged legal ethics inside compelling drama. ensuring the moral of the story was passed down through generations with far more impact than a dry legal decree ever could. The law became intertwined with culture, with identity, and with the very stories people told about who they were and what they believed. It was no longer just a system of control. It was a fundamental part of the human experience, given life, personality, and immense power by the gods who were believed to watch over every aspect of ancient life. Yet for all the power of myth and symbol, these concepts truly came alive not in the quiet reading of a text, but in the shared, electrifying experience of public ritual. This is where the emotional engineering of ancient law reached its zenith, transforming passive belief into active, unforgettable participation. Rituals were the grand theater of justice, the live stage where the stories of the gods were performed, and where every citizen became both audience and actor in a divine drama. Think of it this way: a myth about a punishing god might inspire a private shiver of fear, but a public ceremony where that god's wrath is invoked through chant and sacrifice would generate a collective, palpable dread that resonated through your entire body. It was this multi-sensory immersion that made the law feel less like an idea and more like an undeniable force of nature. Consider the solemn act of oath-taking in ancient Greece. This was not a simple matter of giving one's word. It was a meticulously choreographed ritual designed to trigger maximum psychological impact. The oath-taker would stand before an altar, often with a hand placed upon a sacrificial animal, a pig, a ram, or even a bull. As they swore their oath to Zeus Horkios, the guardian of oaths, they would simultaneously slit the animal's throat. The message was visceral and unmistakable. May my own lifeblood be spilled just as this animal's if I prove false. The gush of blood, the final spasms of the creature, the smell of iron and death, these sensory details forged a direct, horrifying link between a spoken promise and a graphic consequence. It was a memory branded not just on the mind, but on the senses, ensuring that the oath could never be forgotten or taken lightly. The Romans elevated this concept of ritualized law to a high art of statecraft through the mysterious order of the Fetial priests. Their role was to manage the solemn rituals of war and peace, ensuring that every conflict was seen as morally and legally justified in the eyes of the gods. Before declaring war, a Fetial priest would journey to the border of the opposing nation and recite a lengthy, formal declaration of grievances, calling upon Jupiter and the entire pantheon to bear witness. If satisfaction was not given, he would return to Rome and hurl a blood-tipped spear across the border, formally initiating a war that was now sanctified by divine approval. This complex ceremony served a crucial purpose. It engineered a collective sense of awe and righteous conviction. The entire community, watching the priest's precise movements and hearing the ancient chants, felt they were not merely launching a military campaign but participating in a sacred duty, a cosmic correction of wrongs that had the full backing of Jupiter himself. The fear of breaking a treaty was immense because it meant risking not just political reprisal but the literal wrath of heaven. Beyond these formal state functions, smaller, daily rituals constantly reinforced the emotional weight of the law. In Egypt, the daily ritual of presenting Ma'at to the gods in the temple, often in the form of a small feather or a statuette, was a powerful act performed by the pharaoh or his priests. This wasn't an empty gesture, it was a continuous reaffirmation of the cosmic order, a daily promise that the laws of the land mirrored the laws of the universe. For the common people, participating in festivals that reenacted mythological stories like the triumph of Horus over Set, symbolizing order over chaos, immersed them in the emotional core of their legal values. They weren't just watching a play, they were experiencing the relief and joy of justice prevailing, reinforcing their desire to uphold that order in their own lives. Through music, incense, choreographed movement, and symbolic sacrifice, These rituals achieved what scrolls and statutes alone never could. They translated the abstract principles of justice, duty, and consequence into a language that the heart and the gut understood instantly. A law was no longer just words, it was the smell of smoke, the sound of a chant, the sight of blood on an altar, and the shared emotional tremor of a crowd. This is how ancient legal systems built a truly durable compliance, by engraving their norms not on stone tablets, but directly onto the human soul through the unforgettable power of ritual. But these powerful rituals and myths would have been meaningless without the masterful voices that brought them to life, the human instruments through which the law found its emotional resonance. In a world before mass literacy, the storyteller, the shaman, and the priest were far more than entertainers or spiritual guides. They were the living libraries of legal precedent, the charismatic professors of societal norms, and the psychological engineers of their communities. They held the sacred responsibility of translating complex legal and ethical concepts into gripping narratives that would not only be remembered but felt deep in the bones of every listener. Their artistry lay in understanding that a story well told is a lesson permanently learned, and they wielded the tools of their trade with the precision of a master craftsman shaping the moral compass of an entire culture. Think of the Norse skalds, wandering poets who held audiences spellbound in the great halls of chieftains. They didn't simply recite the Eddas and sagas, they performed them. Their voices would rise and fall with the rhythm of the verses, their bodies moving to the cadence of the tale, their eyes locking with those of their listeners to create an intimate, shared experience. When recounting the heroic code of conduct from a saga like that of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, the skald wasn't just describing a battle, he was embodying the virtues of courage, loyalty, and the dire consequences of oath-breaking. He would linger on the gruesome details of a traitor's fate, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper, making the entire hall lean in closer, hearts pounding. Then his tone would swell with triumphant awe as he described the glory and honor bestowed upon the righteous hero, the rewards of valor echoing in the ringing silence of the captivated audience. This was not a dry lecture on law, it was a full sensory immersion into its emotional consequences. This control over the narrative gave these intermediaries immense subtle power. They were the editors of collective memory, the directors of the public's emotional response to the law. A shaman in a tribal society, while recounting an origin myth that explained a hunting taboo, could choose to emphasize the terrifying wrath of the nature spirit offended by a past transgression. By drawing out that part of the story, using repetitive, chant-like phrases and dramatic gestures, he could engineer a collective shiver of fear that reinforced why the rule must never be broken. Conversely, a priest in a temple ceremony could focus on the benevolent protection offered by a goddess to those who followed her laws, using soothing, melodic tones and uplifting imagery to instill a powerful sense of awe, security, and belonging. They could highlight specific characters as paragons of virtue or cautionary tales of vice, essentially curating the legal and moral examples the community would internalize. Their methods were brilliantly adapted to the psychology of oral tradition. Repetition was key, not the boring repetition of a classroom, but the powerful, rhythmic recurrence of a chorus in an epic poem. Important legal principles were woven into refrains that audiences would eventually chant along with, embedding the lesson through participation. Rhyme and meter made complex lists of rules or lineages easier to memorize, turning a legal code into a song that could be passed down unchanged for generations. The use of vivid, concrete imagery comparing justice to a mighty tree with deep roots or deceit to a venomous serpent made abstract concepts instantly graspable and emotionally charged. Their performances transformed the cold text of law into a living, breathing drama where every member of the community could see the stakes, feel the tension, and ultimately absorb the lesson as a personal truth. Through their artistry, the law ceased to be an external imposition and became an internalized narrative, a story each person told themselves about who they were and how they were expected to behave in the world they shared. While the voices of storytellers filled the air with potent narratives, the very stones of ancient cities stood in silent, monumental testament to the power of the law. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Athens, your gaze inevitably drawn upward to the Acropolis, where the magnificent Parthenon stood not merely as a beautiful building, but as a colossal, undeniable statement of order, power, and divine sanction. This was architecture as emotional engineering on a grand scale. The sheer size, the perfect proportions, the gleaming marble, it was all designed to humble you, to make you feel small in the presence of a power far greater than yourself. You didn't need to be told that the goddess Athena watched over the city's laws. You could feel her authority in the weight of the stone and the majesty of the columns. The temple was a permanent, physical anchor for the awe that bound the community to its legal and cosmic ideals. This principle was understood across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the towering ziggurats did not simply bring priests closer to the heavens. They were literal stairways between the divine lawgivers and the human realm, solidifying the connection between celestial command and earthly rule. Their immense stepped forms dominated the flat landscape, a constant visual reminder that the laws governing society descended from above. The effort required to build such structures, the thousands of laborers, the immense resources, itself communicated the supreme importance of the cosmic order they represented. To see a ziggurat was to understand that the community's entire identity and resources were invested in upholding the system it symbolized. This architectural investment made the law feel permanent, immovable, and worth any personal sacrifice. But it wasn't just the exteriors of these buildings that conveyed messages. The interior spaces and their artworks were meticulously designed to immerse a person in the consequences of the law. Step inside an Egyptian noble's tomb, and you would be surrounded by vividly painted frescoes depicting the most pivotal moment of the afterlife, the weighing of the heart ceremony. There, on the wall, you would see the god Anubis carefully placing the deceased's heart on a scale balanced against the feather of Maat. You would see the grotesque, hybrid monster Ammit, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile, waiting patiently to devour the heart should it prove heavy with sin. And you would see the powerful god Osiris presiding over the entire scene as the final judge. This was not decorative art. It was the most critical legal and moral instruction of a lifetime, rendered in terrifyingly clear imagery. A person lived their entire life with the knowledge that this vivid scene awaited them, making every legal and ethical choice feel immediate and monumentally significant. Even in public spaces, art served as a continuous, silent enforcer. Greek temples were adorned with metopes and friezes depicting mythological battles between gods and giants, or between civilized Greeks and barbarous centaurs. These were not random myths. They were allegories for the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between the rule of law and the chaos of lawlessness. A citizen seeing these images would be reminded that the civilized life they enjoyed, with its courts, its assemblies, its property rights, was a hard-won victory that required constant vigilance to maintain. Similarly, Roman forums were filled with statues of great lawmakers and heroes, their stern faces and commanding postures modeling the virtues of duty, justice, and civic responsibility. You were literally surrounded by the founders of your legal tradition, their marble eyes watching your every move, inspiring both pride and a sobering sense of accountability. This omnipresent visual language ensured that the law was never out of sight or out of mind. From the grand temple on the hill to the amulet of a protective deity around a commoner's neck, the symbols of the legal system were woven into the very fabric of daily existence. This constant reinforcement created a powerful psychological environment where legal adherence became second nature. a deeply ingrained habit supported by a world designed to evoke the right emotions at every turn. The community had collectively built a stage for itself where every citizen was an actor in a divine legal drama, and the set design was so convincing, so utterly immersive, that forgetting your lines was simply not an option. Nowhere is this intricate weaving of myth and law more brilliantly displayed than on a single, towering piece of black diorite that once stood in the heart of ancient Babylon. The stele of Hammurabi's code is far more than just an ancient list of rules. It is a masterclass in psychological persuasion, a monumental piece of political theater designed to engineer awe and fear from the moment a citizen laid eyes upon it. At its summit, carved in intricate detail, is the scene that gave the entire code its unshakable authority. King Hammurabi standing not above the sun god Shamash, but in a position of humble reception. Shamash, radiating power with flames flickering from his shoulders, is seated on a celestial throne, extending the rod and ring, symbols of divine kingship and justice, directly to the mortal ruler. This image was the code's very first and most powerful law. It communicated a message more potent than any written statute. "These are not my laws," Hammurabi seemed to say. "They are the eternal decrees of the sun god himself, the all-seeing judge from whom nothing can be hidden." This divine framing was absolutely critical for its acceptance and impact. In a world of competing city-states and shifting allegiances, a legal code imposed by a conquering king could easily be seen as arbitrary, a tool of oppression to be resisted or resented. But a code gifted by the gods, that was an entirely different matter. By linking his laws to Shamash, Hammurabi elevated them from the political to the cosmological. To disobey was not merely to defy a king in Babylon. It was to disrupt the fundamental order of the universe, to stand against the God who brought light to the world and witnessed every single action. This connection engineered a deep, reverential awe for the code itself, transforming it from a set of rules into a sacred text. The sheer craftsmanship of the stele, carved from a single, immense block of gleaming black stone, further amplified this feeling. It was permanent, heavy, and awe-inspiring, a physical embodiment of the law's eternal and unchangeable nature. But the engineering didn't stop with awe. It deftly employed fear through the specific, mirror-like punishments it prescribed. The famous principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was not some primitive barbarism. It was a deliberate echo of the natural, inevitable justice meted out by the gods in Mesopotamian myths. Just as a deity would smite a blasphemer with a precise and fitting punishment, so too would the king's court. This symmetry made the law's retribution feel impersonal, automatic, and utterly inescapable, much like the setting of the sun. The code was filled with these divinely proportioned consequences. If a poorly built house collapsed and killed the owner's son, then the builder's own son would be put to death. The punishment directly mirrored the crime, creating a sense of perfect, almost mathematical balance that felt less like human judgment and more like a natural law of cause and effect, as predictable and fearsome as a thunderstorm. This mythological foundation allowed Hammurabi's code to achieve something remarkable. It fostered emotional conviction and voluntary compliance across a vast and diverse empire. A farmer who felt wronged wouldn't just see a local magistrate. He would feel he was appealing to the justice of Shamash himself. A merchant entering into a contract wasn't just making a deal with another man. He was making a vow under the watchful eye of a god who despised liars. The code became internalized, a part of the individual's moral and psychological landscape, because it was presented not as Hammurabi's will, but as the universe's design. The king, in this brilliant piece of political theater, positioned himself not as a tyrant, but as the humble, faithful servant of the divine order. the mere conduit through which the sun god's eternal justice flowed to all people. This is why his code endured, resonating through centuries and influencing legal traditions for millennia. It succeeded because it understood that the most effective law is not the one that is merely enforced, but the one that is truly believed, felt in the awe for its divine origin and the fear of its perfect mirror-like justice. Perhaps no ancient culture engineered the eternal stakes of justice more vividly than the Egyptians, whose entire concept of law and morality was crystallized in one terrifying, awe-inspiring ceremony, the Judgment of the Dead. This was not a myth confined to scrolls. It was a psychological reality that shaped every waking moment of an Egyptian's life, from the humblest farmer to the mightiest pharaoh. The process was detailed in spells and illustrations within the Book of the Dead, a collection of funerary texts that served as a guidebook for the soul's perilous journey into the afterlife. But its purpose was far more immediate than preparing for death. It was a masterful tool for governing the living. The central, chilling event was the weighing of the heart ceremony, a divine trial where one's entire earthly existence was evaluated on a cosmic scale, with eternity hanging in the balance. Imagine the scene as the Egyptians did. The newly deceased soul, led by the jackal-headed god Anubis, approaches a set of golden scales placed in a hall of towering pillars and watching deities. On one side of the scale, Anubis carefully places the individual's own heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence, memory, and morality. On the other side, he places the feather of Maat, the ultimate symbol of truth, balance, and cosmic order. The entire pantheon watches in solemn silence as the scale begins to move. The ibis-headed god Thoth, the divine scribe, stands ready to record the result with his stylus and tablet. And then there is the most terrifying figure of all, Ammit, the devourer of the dead. This monstrous hybrid creature with the head of a crocodile, the front body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus crouches nearby, her hungry gaze fixed on the scale. She was not a goddess to be worshipped, but a finality to be feared, the embodiment of absolute annihilation. The stakes of this celestial courtroom could not be higher. If the heart, heavy with the weight of lies, selfishness, or wrongdoing, sank lower than the feather, the judgment was immediate and horrific. Ammit would lunge forward, seize the heart, and devour it on the spot. This was not merely a second death. It was the complete and utter erasure of the soul. There was no hope of an afterlife, no paradise in the field of reeds, no existence of any kind. The individual ceased to be forever. This narrative engineered a profound, primal fear that went far beyond any earthly punishment. A fine or imprisonment ends, but oblivion is eternal. This fear was a powerful psychological deterrent, making ethical conduct a matter of personal, eternal survival. Yet for those whose heart was in balance with the feather of Maat, who had lived a life of truth, charity, and respect for the community's laws, the reward was equally powerful in its capacity to inspire awe. The god Osiris, the merciful lord of the afterlife, green-skinned and wrapped in the white linen of mummification, would grant the soul permission to enter the heavenly field of reeds. This was not a passive eternity, but a vibrant, perfect mirror of the best life on earth, without sorrow, hunger, or pain. The justified soul would enjoy the company of the gods and their ancestors, basking in the light of the sun god Ra forever. This promise generated a deep, longing awe, transforming daily acts of honesty and kindness into steps on a sacred path toward eternal bliss. The law was no longer a restriction, but a roadmap to divinity. This entire process was made viscerally real for every Egyptian through the powerful rituals conducted by priests. During the funeral, priests would perform ceremonies that ritually reenacted this judgment, reciting spells from the Book of the Dead designed to guide and protect the soul. For the wealthy, these spells were written on papyrus and placed in their coffin. For others, the key elements were recited aloud, but the teaching started long before death. Priests and teachers used this myth to educate children and adults alike about the consequences of their actions. Every time a person was tempted to cheat, steal, or bear false witness, the image of Ammit and the scales would flash in their mind. The emotional weight of this story was a more effective regulator of behavior than any human police force could ever be, ensuring that the principle of Maat was woven into the very fabric of daily Egyptian life, making every action, no matter how small, a part of one's eternal divine trial. This visual language of symbols was one of the most ingenious and democratic aspects of ancient legal engineering, a silent code that transcended literacy and language barriers to speak directly to the human psyche. A farmer who couldn't read a single word of a legal decree could look upon a statue of a goddess holding scales and instantly understand the core principle of balanced justice. A merchant from a foreign land, unfamiliar with the local tongue, could see a carving of a thunderbolt above a city gate and immediately comprehend the formidable divine power backing the laws within. Symbols acted as a universal translator for legal and moral concepts, condensing volumes of complex philosophy into a single, emotionally potent image that could be understood and felt by anyone, regardless of their station in life. The scales held by figures like the Greek Themis or the Egyptian Maat are perhaps the most enduring and powerful example. Their genius lies in their perfect, intuitive simplicity. Everyone, from a child to an elder, understands the physical principle of a scale. When things are equal, it balances. This simple mechanism became a profound metaphor for fairness, for the careful weighing of evidence, and for the ideal that a decision should only be reached after both sides of a story have been considered. It transformed the abstract goal of justice into something tactile and visual, but the symbolism often went even deeper. The materials mattered. Golden scales suggested a divine, incorruptible standard, while the act of weighing something as intimate as a human heart, as in Egyptian belief, connected the concept of justice directly to the inner moral state of an individual, not just their outward actions. Another layer was often added to this symbol, the blindfold. While a more modern addition to Lady Justice, the principle of impartiality was deeply embedded in ancient thought. The message of the blindfold was radical for its time. True justice is not swayed by wealth, status, power, or identity. It does not see the beggar or the king standing before it. It sees only the facts of the case and the weight of the evidence. This symbolized a monumental shift from personalistic justice, where a ruler might favor a friend or a noble, toward a system aspiring to objective, impersonal fairness. The blindfold told a story of a law that applied equally to all, a concept that was as awe-inspiring in its ideal as it was fearsome in its impersonal application. It was a promise of protection for the weak and a warning to the powerful. Conversely, symbols like the serpent, most famously in the Mesopotamian caduceus, wielded a more complex and ambivalent power. The serpent, with its ability to shed its skin, was often associated with rebirth, healing, and wisdom, attributes of a just ruler who could restore order. But its venomous bite and deceptive nature also made it a perfect emblem for the dangers of deceit, betrayal, and the poisonous consequences of breaking an oath. The caduceus, with two serpents coiled around a staff, encapsulated this duality. It represented the divine authority of a messenger, making him inviolable, but it also served as a stark reminder of the tangled web of lies and the inevitable payback for those who violated sacred trust. It was a symbol that simultaneously inspired awe for authority and a deep, instinctual fear of the consequences of challenging it. Then there were the symbols of raw, unmediated power, like the thunderbolt clutched in the fist of Zeus or the Indra of Vedic tradition. This was not the balanced, measured energy of the scales. This was the instant, terrifying, and absolute power of divine retribution. The thunderbolt was a symbol that bypassed reason, and spoke directly to humanity's most primal fears of uncontrollable nature and sudden, violent death. It communicated that certain transgressions like oath-breaking or hubris against the gods would not be met with a balanced trial but with immediate and utter annihilation. It was the ultimate symbol of deterrence, designed to create a level of fear so profound that the very thought of such crimes would be unthinkable. This symbol ensured that the law's power was not always perceived as slow and deliberative, but could also be swift, final, and awe-inspiring in its destructive capacity. By embedding these symbols into every facet of public life, on coins, on the pediments of temples, on the seals of judges, and in the stories repeated for generations, ancient legal systems created a constant, low-level hum of emotional conditioning. A citizen was never far from a reminder of what their society valued and what it feared. This visual language ensured the law's presence was felt even in the absence of its enforcers, building a self-regulating society where the symbols themselves became the silent, ever-watchful guardians of order. This preventative power of myth transformed legal education from a reactive system of punishment into a proactive culture of internalized restraint. Think of the profound difference between a society that must constantly police its citizens and one where the citizens, from the youngest age, have already policed themselves through the powerful stories they've absorbed. The myth of Icarus is a perfect archetype of this mechanism. It wasn't a law code stating, "Do not act with excessive pride." It was a vivid, tragic narrative about a boy who, intoxicated by the thrill of flight and ignoring his father's wise counsel, soared ever higher until the sun melted the wax holding his wings together. The story doesn't end with a trial or a fine. It ends with Icarus plunging from the sky into the sea, a direct and inevitable consequence of his own reckless choices. This tale engineered a specific, tangible fear, the fear of catastrophic failure born from overconfidence. A young Greek hearing this story wouldn't just learn a rule, they would feel the dizzying height, the searing heat, and the terrifying fall in their imagination. The lesson became an emotional memory, a gut-level understanding that certain boundaries existed for a reason, and transgressing them led not to a meeting with a magistrate, but to a personal, irreversible disaster. This strategy of emotional vaccination through narrative extended far beyond Greece. Norse mythology is filled with stories that functioned as preventative legal advisories, none more potent than the intricate web of prophecies surrounding Ragnarok. This wasn't merely an exciting tale of gods and monsters battling at the end of the world. It was a profound lesson on the inescapable nature of fate and the consequences of actions that set cosmic wheels in motion. The death of the beloved god Balder, orchestrated by Loki's malice and a seemingly harmless mistletoe dart, set into motion an irreversible sequence of events. The myth taught that a single act of deceit, a breach of trust, could have ramifications so vast they could ultimately unravel the entire cosmos. For a Viking warrior, this story instilled a deep-seated caution. It encouraged a culture of honesty and oath-keeping not just because it was a rule, but because the very stability of reality seemed to depend on it. The awe for the god's power was matched by a fearful respect for the chain of cause and effect, making individuals think twice before engaging in betrayal, knowing their actions were part of a larger, fragile tapestry. This preventative approach offered ancient societies a tremendous practical advantage. It was incredibly resource efficient. Maintaining a police force, a court system, and prisons requires a massive investment of a community's time, energy, and wealth. For early civilizations operating on the edge of survival, these were luxuries they could scarcely afford. A well-told myth, however, was a low-cost, high-impact tool. A storyteller could captivate an entire village around a single fire, and the lessons imparted would ripple outwards for generations. The myth did the work of 1,000 constables, patrolling not the streets but the minds of the people. It established a system of internal surveillance where the individual's own conscience, shaped by these terrifying and awe-inspiring stories, became the primary enforcer. This fostered a culture of moral vigilance where people weren't just avoiding punishment but actively striving to be the kind of person who wouldn't require punishment. The humble citizen who heeds warnings, the honest trader who keeps their word, the faithful individual who upholds their community's sacred values. Ultimately, these shared stories built a powerful framework of voluntary compliance. When everyone in a community knows the same foundational myths, they share a common language of right and wrong. They understand the cultural touchstones and the dire fates that befall those who ignore them. This creates a social contract woven not from parchment, but from narrative. A person's reputation was tied to how well they embodied the heroic ideals of these stories or avoided the tragic flaws of their villains. To act against the grain was not just to break a rule, it was to alienate oneself from the shared identity of the group, to become the subject of the next cautionary tale. This social pressure, amplified by the deep emotional resonance of myth, was often a far stronger deterrent than any written law could ever be, building a resilient and self-regulating society anchored in the timeless power of a story well told. This transition from the spoken word to the written word was one of the most pivotal moments in the history of law, but it was far from a simple replacement of one medium with another. It was a delicate, strategic fusion, a conscious effort to capture the raw, emotional power of oral storytelling within the enduring, authoritative framework of written text. The earliest lawmakers understood that simply writing down a rule could make it seem dry, bureaucratic, and open to debate. But a rule presented as a timeless decree from a god, etched into a public monument. That carried an entirely different weight, a psychological gravity designed to endure for generations. They were not abandoning the old ways, but rather building upon them, using the new technology of writing to amplify and eternalize the emotional impact of myth. Consider the stark, unforgiving laws of Draco in ancient Athens, drafted in the 7th century BC. The term draconian has come to symbolize harshness for a reason, as his code was infamous for prescribing death as the penalty for even minor offenses. But the power of these laws didn't just come from their severity, it came from their presentation. These written statutes were not hidden away in an archive. They were inscribed on a set of wooden tablets attached to rectangular pyramids that could be rotated, making them accessible for all citizens to see and read. More importantly, they were almost certainly introduced with a preamble invoking the god's authority. This public display transformed the laws from a set of abstract principles into a permanent, visible, and awe-inspiring force in the city's center. The act of writing them down made them seem immutable and objective, removing the potential for a storyteller's bias or an elder's faulty memory. Yet, by framing them within the context of divine will, they retained that crucial element of sacred terror. A citizen reading that a theft would be punished by death wasn't just reading a human decree. They were confronting a divine ordinance set in stone, a fearsome truth that felt as permanent and unchangeable as the will of the gods themselves. The Romans perfected this hybrid approach with their 12 tables, the foundation of Roman law. According to tradition, these laws were created around 450 BC to resolve a conflict between the patrician elite and the common plebeians who demanded that the laws be made public and applied equally to all. A commission was sent to Greece to study the laws of Solon, and upon their return, the 12 tables were drafted and displayed in the Roman Forum. This act of writing and public display was in itself a revolutionary step toward fairness and transparency. But the content itself was deeply rooted in the older, oral tradition of sacred law. The tables began with a solemn religious invocation and were filled with procedures that were essentially ritualized scripts, prescribing exact phrases to be spoken during legal actions like bringing a defendant to court or claiming a debt. This preserved the performative, almost magical power of the spoken word within the structure of written statute. The law wasn't just text, it was a script for a sacred public drama where saying the correct words in the correct order was just as important as the facts of the case. This ensured that even as Roman law became more complex and precise, it never lost its connection to the ritualistic awe that gave it authority in the first place. The scribes and officials who transcribed these early legal codes were not mere clerks. They were cultural translators and psychological architects. Their task was to transfer the thunderous tone of an oral epic poem or the chilling warning of a priestly prophecy into a static, visual format. To do this, they employed specific literary techniques borrowed directly from their oral predecessors. They used repetitive, formulaic language that echoed the refrains of ancient stories. They incorporated vivid, metaphorical descriptions of punishments that were designed to make a reader's stomach clench, much like a storyteller's graphic tale of underworld torment would make a listener shudder. The goal was to make the reader of the text feel the law, not just understand it intellectually. The permanence of writing was used to reinforce the supposed timelessness of the mythological truths within. A myth about a god giving laws to a king could be seen as a story from a vague, distant past. But that same story, carved at the top of a legal stele that stood in the city square for centuries, became an unchallengeable historical fact. Writing didn't kill the emotional core of myth-based law. It gave it a bronze tongue and a stone body, allowing it to speak to larger populations across greater distances and through longer stretches of time, all while maintaining its powerful grip on the human heart. Yet for all their power to unite communities under shared values, these myth-based legal systems were far from impartial. They were masterfully crafted tools that often reinforced and legitimized starkly different expectations for men and women, engineering specific emotional responses to keep each gender within prescribed social boundaries. This wasn't a matter of accidental bias, but a deliberate use of narrative to make deeply unequal legal structures feel natural, inevitable, and divinely sanctioned. The stories a culture tells about its gods and heroes are never just entertainment. They are blueprints for behavior, and in the ancient world, those blueprints were meticulously drawn along gender lines, using fear and awe to ensure compliance with a hierarchical vision of society. Consider the intricate and often terrifying web of myths surrounding the Greek goddess Hera, queen of Olympus. While Zeus was free to pursue countless mortal and divine lovers, the narratives consistently portrayed Hera's reaction not as unjustified anger, but as a monstrous, disproportionate vengeance directed primarily at the women involved. The story of Io, a young priestess seduced by Zeus, is a harrowing example. To protect Io from Hera's wrath, Zeus transformed her into a white heifer. But Hera saw through the ruse, claimed the heifer as a gift, and set the 100-eyed giant Argus to watch over her, ensuring Io's eternal imprisonment and separation from humanity. Later, she sent a gadfly to torment Io, driving her to wander the earth in endless, frantic agony. For a woman in ancient Greece hearing this myth, the message was chillingly clear. The story engineered a very specific kind of fear, not fear of a husband's infidelity, but fear of the catastrophic consequences that could befall her if she were perceived as the cause of it, even unwillingly. The legal reality on the ground, where adultery laws punished women far more severely than men, was thus emotionally reinforced by a divine narrative. A woman's compliance with strict marital fidelity was not just a social rule, it was a matter of personal survival, a way to avoid attracting the attention of a heavenly queen whose wrath was as inevitable as it was horrifying. For men, the emotional engineering worked in a completely different direction. aiming to inspire not fear of transgression but awe for a specific, idealized version of masculinity. The entire epic tradition, from the Iliad to the tales of Hercules, was a vast machine for producing awe and a sense of duty centered on concepts of honor, physical prowess, and glory in battle. Achilles' choice, a short, glorious life that would be remembered forever over a long, anonymous one, was the ultimate lesson in what a man should value. This narrative awe was directly tied to legal and social privileges, inheritance laws, citizenship rights, and the authority to participate in public life were all reserved for men who embodied these heroic ideals. The awe inspired by these stories made accepting the burdens and risks of masculinity, the duty to fight, to provide, to lead, feel like a privilege and a path to immortality, rather than a restrictive set of obligations. It emotionally compensated for the heavy demands placed upon them by framing those demands as the stuff of legend. This gendered emotional engineering created a self-perpetuating cycle that reinforced legal inequality. Women, conditioned by stories of terrifying divine retribution for sexual transgression, internalized a fear of shame that made them more likely to accept laws that restricted their autonomy. Men, intoxicated by awe for heroic honor, were driven to compete for status in the public sphere, further entrenching their dominance there. The myths made this arrangement feel like a natural, divine order rather than a human-made hierarchy. The law didn't just say women couldn't own property in some cases. The story of Pandora explained how the first woman was a beautiful curse unleashed upon mankind, bringing with her all the evils of the world. This narrative linked the legal subjugation of women to a primal, cosmological mistake, making it seem like a necessary defense against chaos. This pattern repeats across cultures. In ancient Rome, the legend of Lucretia served as a foundational myth for the entire republic. After being raped by the king's son, she summoned her family, revealed the crime, and then took her own life to preserve the family's honor. Her story wasn't told to evoke sympathy for victims, but to inspire awe for female pudicious sexual virtue, and to frame a woman's chastity as a commodity more valuable than her life itself, directly tied to the honor of her male relatives. Her death sparked a revolution, making her a symbol, but the lesson for women was clear. Your body is not your own. It is a vessel for male honor, and its violation necessitates your ultimate sacrifice. This extreme narrative helped enforce strict laws around female sexuality and justified the immense legal power a paterfamilias held over the women in his household. Conversely, Norse mythology's Valkyries, divine shield maidens who chose which warriors would die in battle and be taken to Valhalla, engineered awe in men by linking violent, honorable death to the promise of an eternal feast with the gods. This glorious narrative ensured a steady supply of men willing to fight and die for their chieftain, upholding a legal and social system where martial prowess was the primary path to status and wealth. The emotion here wasn't fear of punishment but awe for a sublime reward, a powerful incentive to fulfill the dangerous duties expected of their gender. By examining these myths, we see that ancient law was never a neutral set of rules. It was a deeply psychological project that used storytelling to make people want to conform to their assigned roles, to feel that the existing social order was right, beautiful, and ordained by the gods themselves. The fear and awe were not byproducts. They were the very engines of control, ensuring that legal inequalities were not just obeyed but emotionally accepted as the way of the world. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these ancient systems was their remarkable adaptability. The stories that underpinned the law were never set in stone for all eternity. They were living, breathing narratives that evolved in lockstep with the societies they served. When faced with new social realities, political upheavals, or cultural exchanges, the old myths were not discarded. Instead, they were skillfully retooled, their emotional cores preserved while their details were updated to address contemporary anxieties and justify new forms of control. This evolutionary process ensured that the powerful tools of fear and awe never lost their potency, even as the world around them transformed beyond recognition. The expansion of the Roman Empire provides a brilliant case study in this adaptive process. As Roman legions conquered vast new territories from Britain to Egypt, they faced a monumental challenge: how to govern a staggering diversity of peoples, each with their own gods, traditions, and legal customs. Imposing Roman law by sheer force alone would have been a recipe for constant rebellion. Instead, the Romans employed a strategy of brilliant mythological diplomacy. They didn't just demand obedience to Jupiter and Mars. They actively sought out and incorporated foreign deities into their own state religion, creating a vast, inclusive pantheon that could inspire awe and loyalty across cultures. The Great Mother Cybele, a powerful goddess originally worshipped in Anatolia, is a prime example. As Rome's power grew and its social fabric stretched thin, the state officially adopted her cult in 204 BCE, during the desperate turmoil of the Second Punic War. Her myth was one of resurrection and fierce protection, and her ecstatic, drumming priests offered a passionate, emotional form of worship that resonated deeply with people feeling disconnected from the more stoic, traditional Roman gods. By bringing Cybele to Rome and building her a temple on the Palatine Hill, the Senate wasn't just adding a new goddess, they were sending a powerful message to their new Eastern subjects. They were saying, "Your gods are our gods, your values are part of our empire, your loyalty to Rome is a loyalty to your own divine protectors." This act of mythological integration used the awe for a foreign deity to smooth the rough edges of conquest and make imperial rule feel less like an occupation and more like a sacred partnership. A similar strategy was used with the cult of Mithras, the soldier god who slays the cosmic bull. This mystery religion, with its powerful themes of brotherhood, discipline, and triumph over darkness, spread like wildfire through the Roman legions, a mobile and incredibly influential segment of society. Rather than suppress it, the Roman state tacitly endorsed it, recognizing that the awe and loyalty Mithras inspired in his devotees translated directly into loyalty to the empire they served. The myths of Mithras, practiced in underground temples from Hadrian's Wall to the Syrian desert, provided a shared spiritual and moral framework for soldiers from Gaul, North Africa, and Thrace. It gave them a common identity that transcended their local origins, binding them to each other and to the imperial project with bonds stronger than any mere military oath. The law of the legion was thus emotionally reinforced by a myth that felt personal and profound, ensuring discipline and cohesion in the most far-flung corners of the empire. Conversely, in times of internal crisis or perceived moral decay, the same flexible system could be weaponized to generate fear and justify the clampdown of stricter laws. When a republic or empire felt itself under threat from within, from corruption, luxury, or social unrest, rulers and moralists would often revive or emphasize terrifying myths of a lost golden age or a coming chaos. They would point to old prophecies warning of doom if traditional values were abandoned, or they would tell stories of past calamities brought on by divine displeasure. The reign of Emperor Augustus is a masterclass in this approach. After a century of bloody civil wars that had shattered the Roman Republic, Augustus faced the daunting task of restoring order and legitimizing his new autocratic rule. He didn't just pass new laws against adultery and promoting marriage. He launched a full-scale cultural revolution backed by mythological engineering. He heavily promoted the myth of a returning golden age, a new era of peace and prosperity brought about by his wise rule and his divine ancestor, the god Apollo. Poets like Virgil were commissioned to write the Aeneid, an epic that directly linked the founding of Rome and the Julian family to the goddess Venus and the heroic destiny of Aeneas. This narrative inspired a collective awe for the new regime, framing it not as a political power grab but as the glorious fulfillment of an ancient divine plan. At the same time, to ensure compliance with his new moral laws, Augustus also leveraged fear. He pointed to the recent civil wars as evidence of the gods' wrath against a corrupt and immoral society. His message was clear: the strict new laws were not his personal whim. They were a necessary medicine to cure the Roman people of the decadence that had nearly destroyed them and to avert further divine punishment. The myths of a glorious past that could be regained through virtue and a horrific recent past that would return through vice were used in tandem to make citizens willingly accept a dramatic reduction in their personal freedoms. The law changed, and the myths evolved to make that change feel both inevitable and sacred. This dynamic interplay shows that legal myths were never mere relics of a superstitious past. They were sophisticated, responsive instruments of governance. They could be expanded to include new peoples, contracted to enforce new social norms, or sharpened to meet a crisis. Their power lay in their fluidity. They could be reshaped to engineer the precise emotional response needed to maintain social order, whether that was the awe of inclusion or the fear of collapse. By adapting the story, the lawmakers could change the rules, ensuring that the heart of the law always beat in rhythm with the anxieties and aspirations of the time. What becomes truly striking when we step back from any single civilization is how these powerful tools of emotional engineering emerged independently across the globe, each culture crafting its own unique stories to serve the same fundamental purpose of social control. The Norse peoples of Scandinavia, living in a harsh and often unforgiving landscape, developed a legal and moral framework steeped in the grim inevitability of fate, known as weird. This was not a gentle concept. It was the understanding that an individual's path and ultimate destiny were already woven into the fabric of the universe by the Norns, the mysterious goddesses of fate. This belief fostered a grim acceptance of one's prescribed role and the laws that governed it. Why follow the complex codes of honor and blood feud? Because to do otherwise was to fight against the very threads of your own existence, an act of futile madness. This sense of inevitable destiny was magnified 1,000-fold by the overarching myth of Ragnarok, the prophesied twilight of the gods. In this ultimate battle, even the mighty Odin and Thor would fall, and the entire cosmos would be consumed in fire and flood. For a Viking, this narrative engineered a specific kind of courageous resignation. The law was not about achieving eternal justice, but about conducting oneself with honor and bravery in a world that was fundamentally, tragically doomed. Your actions in the brief time you had were what mattered, and the law provided the only path to a reputation that would outlive the stars themselves. On the other side of the world, ancient Chinese legalism took a far more pragmatic and state-centered approach, yet it masterfully wielded the tool of awe to achieve total obedience. While philosophers like Han Fei Tzu argued for a system of clear, harsh, and impartially applied laws, the legitimacy of these laws was often derived from the older, deeply ingrained concept of the mandate of heaven. This was the belief that the emperor, the son of heaven, ruled only with the divine approval of the celestial order. His legal decrees were therefore not merely human commands but reflections of cosmic will. Stories and historical records were carefully curated to reinforce this awe-inspiring connection. A dynasty that ruled wisely and upheld justice was said to possess the mandate. One that became corrupt or let the people suffer would be struck by natural disasters, rebellions, and ultimately downfall, clear signs that the mandate had been withdrawn. This created a powerful feedback loop where the law was legitimized by a divine aura. Citizens were awed into obedience not by the fear of a specific underworld torture, but by the overwhelming power of a cosmic system that anointed their rulers and sanctioned their laws. To break the law was not just to offend the emperor, it was to disrupt the harmony between heaven and earth, an act of such profound imbalance that it could invite famine, flood, or earthquake upon the entire population. This collective responsibility engineered a powerful form of social pressure, where obedience was a civic and cosmic duty. Meanwhile, across the vast continents of the Americas, indigenous cultures developed legal storytelling traditions that were equally sophisticated, but often employed a strikingly different emotional palette. The Navajo or Dene people have a rich cycle of stories featuring the trickster figure, Coyote. Unlike the stern, awe-inspiring gods of other pantheons, Coyote is a complex, ambivalent character. Clever, foolish, creative, and destructive, often within the same tale. In one story, Coyote might successfully secure fire or seasons for humanity, demonstrating cleverness and earning a degree of admiration. In the very next, his greed, arrogance, or uncontrolled appetites would lead him into disastrous and often darkly humorous situations. This blend of humor and horror made the lessons incredibly memorable and accessible. A story about Coyote's theft of food leading to him being beaten or humiliated taught clear lessons about the legal and social consequences of stealing in a way that a simple proclamation never could. The horror came from the graphic, relatable outcomes of his poor choices. The humor made the story enjoyable to hear again and again, ensuring the lesson was passed down. This narrative approach didn't just instill a fear of punishment. It fostered a deep understanding of cause and effect, of balance and reciprocity, which were the foundations of Dene law and ethics. It taught that the law was not a distant, abstract force, but a practical guide for living in harmony with your community and the natural world, and that violating it would lead not to divine wrath, but to tangible, often embarrassing, personal failure. When we place these three traditions side by side, the Norse acceptance of fate, the Chinese awe of celestial mandate, and the Navajo lessons from a trickster, their differences are obvious, yet their underlying psychological architecture is remarkably similar. Each culture identified the core emotions that would most effectively resonate with their people and their environment. The Norse, facing a brutal world, used narratives of inevitable doom to foster courage and lawful honor. The Chinese, building a massive, complex state, used awe for a cosmic system to legitimize centralized authority. The Navajo, living in close-knit communal bands, used relatable, humorous, yet cautionary tales to teach practical ethics and social responsibility. They all understood that a dry list of rules could never penetrate the human heart as deeply as a well-told story. They all used narrative to transform the abstract concept of the law into something that could be felt in the gut, as dread for the coming Ragnarok, wonder for the mandate of heaven, or laughter at Coyote's foolishness. This cross-cultural ingenuity reveals a universal human truth. To govern effectively, one must first captivate the imagination. The stories a culture tells about right and wrong are never mere decoration. They are the very bedrock upon which the law is built and the emotional engine that ensures it is obeyed. However, this masterful use of storytelling to shape behavior inevitably leads us to a profound and unsettling question. At what point does persuasive narrative cross the line into psychological manipulation, and what does this mean for human freedom? The very effectiveness of myth-based legal systems reveals a deep ethical tension between societal stability and individual autonomy. Ancient rulers, while perhaps believing they served a greater good, were ultimately leveraging humanity's deepest psychological vulnerabilities: our fear of the unknown, our longing for meaning, our awe of the sublime, to direct thought and action in ways that primarily served their own authority. This practice, however culturally embedded, often came at a steep cost to genuine justice and the right to question, doubt, or imagine alternatives. Consider the pervasive doctrine of divine kingship, a concept expertly engineered through awe-inspiring myths across countless cultures, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of Japan. These rulers weren't merely political leaders, they were portrayed as living gods, or at least as the sole, indispensable conduits to the divine. Their connection to the celestial realm was not presented as a matter of debate but as a foundational truth, repeated in rituals, etched into temple walls, and woven into the creation stories every child learned. This generated a powerful, almost unquestioning awe that transformed obedience from a civic duty into a religious obligation. To challenge the king's decree was not just treason, it was sacrilege, a sin against the cosmic order itself. This emotional framework made it exceedingly difficult for populations to resist even the most tyrannical edicts, as dissent felt like a violation of a sacred covenant. The system was designed to bypass critical thinking entirely, appealing directly to the heart with such overwhelming reverence that the mind simply surrendered. Conversely, fear-based narratives were routinely deployed to suppress social progress and stifle intellectual dissent. A society held in the grip of terrifying myths about divine punishment for innovation or questioning is a society that remains static, controlled, and ultimately oppressed. The ancient Greek myth of Prometheus offers a fascinatingly ambiguous example. On one hand, he is a cultural hero who gifted humanity with fire and technology. On the other, he is brutally punished by Zeus for his transgression, chained to a rock to have his liver eternally devoured. For every innovative thinker in ancient Greece, this story served as a potent, double-edged warning. While it celebrated the benefits of progress, it simultaneously and vividly illustrated the terrifying price of obtaining knowledge that the gods had deemed forbidden. This kind of narrative could easily be emphasized by conservative priests or leaders to discourage challenges to the status quo, engineering a fear that kept potentially revolutionary ideas safely contained. This manipulation extended into the enforcement of rigid social hierarchies, where myths were crafted to make inequality seem like a natural, even divine arrangement. The Hindu concept of the Varna system, described in the Rig Veda with the allegory of the Purusha, presented the four main social classes as originating from different parts of a primordial cosmic being. The priests came from the mouth, the warriors from the arms, the merchants from the thighs, and the laborers from the feet. This was not presented as a man-made structure open to critique, but as an inherent biological fact of the universe. The awe inspired by this cosmic origin story served to legitimize vast disparities in power, wealth, and dignity, encouraging those at the bottom of the hierarchy to accept their lot with a sense of resigned duty rather than righteous anger. Their position was framed not as an injustice but as their preordained role in maintaining the balance of the entire world, a powerful emotional argument that served to perpetuate their oppression for generations. Reflecting on these ancient strategies forces a crucial introspection about our own modern legal and political systems. While we may have moved away from literal myths of gods and monsters, the tools of emotional engineering are still very much in use. Political campaigns, nationalistic fervor, and even the branding of justice systems often rely on inspiring awe for certain symbols or fear of certain groups. The ethical challenge, then and now, is to distinguish between using emotion to reinforce shared values that protect human dignity and using it to manipulate and control. A healthy legal system should engage our emotions to help us connect with abstract principles like fairness and compassion, not to short-circuit our critical faculties and demand blind obedience. The legacy of ancient myth-based law is a permanent reminder that the most powerful law is the one written on the human heart, and with that power comes a profound responsibility to ensure it is written with ethical ink, guiding us not toward subservience, but toward a more genuine and equitable form of justice. Even as we pride ourselves on living in a rational age of statutes and legal codes, the silent, powerful undercurrents of ancient emotional engineering still shape our modern halls of justice in ways we might not immediately perceive. While the gods may have receded from the courtroom, their symbolic avatars and the psychological strategies they represent have not. We need only look up at the statues adorning our courthouses to see the direct lineage. Lady Justice, with her scales, sword, and blindfold, is not merely a decorative motif. She is the secularized descendant of Themis and Maat, a carefully crafted symbol designed to evoke a very specific set of feelings. The scales speak to our deep-seated yearning for balance and measured judgment, a concept that feels inherently right and true. The blindfold, a later addition, inspires awe for the ideal of impartiality. The breathtaking notion that the law should not see wealth, power, or identity, but only the facts of the case. And the sword reminds us of the law's power to enforce its decrees, introducing a note of solemn fear that underscores the seriousness of the proceedings. This triad of symbols works in concert to condition our emotional response to the legal system before a single argument is even heard, blending awe for an ideal with a respectful dread of its power. This engineering of fear, so central to ancient deterrence, has also found its place in the modern world, though its mechanisms have evolved from mythological tales to media spectacles. High-profile trials are frequently broadcast and dissected in the public square of the 24-hour news cycle, serving a function remarkably similar to the ancient recitation of cautionary myths. The detailed coverage of a sentencing hearing where the grim consequences of a crime are laid bare is not just about informing the public, it is a form of societal storytelling that screams a clear, visceral message: this could be you. The massive sentences handed down in these cases, and their subsequent publicity, are modern-day equivalents of the story of Sisyphus, a stark, unforgettable lesson in the catastrophic personal cost of breaking the social contract. The fear is no longer of a multi-headed monster in the underworld, but of losing decades of one's life to a prison cell, a fate made terrifyingly real through the vivid narratives presented by the media. Perhaps the most potent form of contemporary awe is reserved for our secular scriptures, national constitutions, and founding documents. These texts are treated not as the flawed, amendable products of human compromise that they are, but as near-sacred relics. They are enshrined in argon-filled cases handled with white gloves and spoken of with a reverence once reserved for religious texts. The stories we tell about their creation, the wisdom of the Founding Fathers, the miracle of Philadelphia, the relentless pursuit of liberty are our national myths. They serve the exact same purpose as the tale of Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, to legitimize the authority of the legal system by connecting it to a moment of transcendent, almost divine inspiration. This instills a powerful, awe-based loyalty to the framework of the law itself, encouraging citizens to see it as the bedrock of national identity rather than a mere set of rules to be debated or amended. We are taught to stand in awe of the system, which in turn encourages compliance and faith in its fundamental fairness. This emotional appeal is not left to chance. It is actively harnessed in public campaigns designed to shape behavior. Law enforcement agencies and government bodies routinely employ emotional storytelling in their public service announcements, understanding that data and statistics are far less effective than a narrative that tugs at the heartstrings or induces a chill of fear. A campaign against drunk driving doesn't just quote crash rates. It shows the grieving family, the shattered lives, the single moment of poor judgment that leads to eternal remorse. These are the cautionary tales of our time, engineered to create a strong associative fear that makes a potential offender think twice before getting behind the wheel. Similarly, campaigns that highlight the heroic actions of police officers or first responders are designed to generate awe and respect for these institutions, fostering a sense of public trust and legitimacy that makes citizens more likely to cooperate and comply with the law voluntarily. This is emotional engineering in its purest, most practical form, leveraging the same ancient understanding of human psychology to achieve modern public safety goals. Recognizing this enduring legacy does not diminish our legal systems. Instead, it offers a deeper understanding of their power and persistence. The law has never operated solely on the cold, hard logic of reason. Its strength and authority have always been rooted in its ability to speak to the whole human being, to our hopes, our fears, and our profound need to believe in a world that is just, orderly, and meaningful. The ancient strategies of using symbol, story, and ritual to engineer these emotions were not primitive. They were brilliantly effective. Our modern world has not abandoned them but has rather refined and secularized them, swapping the thunderbolt of Zeus for the gavel of a judge, and the weighing of the heart against the feather of mat for the deliberation of a jury. This seamless blending of ancient emotional resonance with contemporary legal practice demonstrates that while our symbols and stories may change, the fundamental human needs they address for order, meaning, and security remain timeless. The law continues to hold its power over us not just because it commands our obedience, but because it first captures our imagination and speaks directly to our souls. It turns out that the ancient architects of myth-based law were not just storytellers but intuitive psychologists, and modern science now provides the framework to understand precisely why their methods were so remarkably effective. Consider the concept of classical conditioning, famously demonstrated by Pavlov's dogs. The principle is simple. Pair a neutral stimulus with a potent one repeatedly, and eventually, the neutral stimulus will trigger the same response on its own. Ancient legal systems were masterful at this. The law itself might be the neutral stimulus, a simple rule about honesty or respecting boundaries. But by repeatedly pairing it with the potent, visceral imagery of a multi-headed monster devouring a sinful heart or a god hurling a thunderbolt at an oath breaker, the rule itself began to evoke a deep-seated emotional response. The abstract concept of perjury became conditioned to trigger a gut-level fear of divine lightning, making truth-telling feel less like a civic duty and more like a matter of personal survival. This psychological wiring, done through generations of storytelling, ensured compliance was automatic and emotional, not just intellectual. This leads us directly to the power of narrative transportation, the phenomenon where a well-told story pulls us so completely into its world that we temporarily adopt the beliefs and emotions of the characters. When a Greek citizen listened to a rhapsode perform the tragic tale of Icarus, they didn't just hear a story, they flew with him. They felt the exhilarating rush of the ascent, the growing anxiety as the sun warmed their back, and the sheer, stomach-dropping terror of the fall. This immersive experience didn't just teach them that hubris was bad, it made them feel the catastrophic consequences in their very bones. The lesson was encoded not as a dry fact to be remembered, but as a visceral memory to be avoided. Ancient lawmakers and storytellers were expert pilots of this psychological journey, skillfully navigating their audiences into emotional landscapes where the desired legal and moral lessons felt like personal discoveries rather than imposed commands. Modern research into fear appeals, particularly in health communication, validates this ancient intuition about deterrence. Studies consistently show that for a fear-based message to be effective, it cannot just hint at a negative outcome. It must be vivid, personal, and offer a clear, actionable solution. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is a textbook example of this principle in action. The fear wasn't vague, it was horrifyingly specific, the grotesque figure of Ammit, the devourer, waiting to end your existence. But it wasn't just a threat, it provided the clear solution, live a life in accordance with Mat. The heart scarabs buried with the deceased, inscribed with spells to prevent the heart from speaking against its owner, were the tangible, recommended action to avoid the feared outcome. This ancient model mirrors exactly what a modern public health campaign does when it shows the graphic consequences of smoking and then provides a quitline number. The psychological mechanism is identical. Vivid fear, paired with a perceived efficacy to avoid it, is a powerful driver of behavior. On the flip side, the emotion of awe has been shown by psychologists to promote prosocial behaviors, increase generosity, and foster a phenomenon known as system justification, the tendency to defend and bolster the status quo. This explains the incredible social cohesion achieved by myths that framed legal systems as part of a majestic cosmic order. When a Hindu devotee heard the laws of Manu were the thoughts of Brahma, or a Roman citizen witnessed the elaborate, awe-inspiring rituals of the festal priests, they weren't just following rules. They were participating in something vast and magnificent. This feeling of awe reduced their focus on individual wants and amplified their connection to the collective and the system that governed it. It made the existing social and legal hierarchy feel not just acceptable, but right, beautiful, and worth defending. The law became synonymous with the awe-inspiring order of the cosmos itself. This connects profoundly to the psychological concept of sacred values. These are values that people treat as absolute, non-negotiable, and immune to standard cost-benefit analysis. Think of values like freedom, patriotism, or family honor. People will often refuse to compromise on them, even for substantial material gain. Ancient myths were genius machines for transforming practical legal principles into sacred values. A rule about fair trade wasn't just good for the economy. It was a reflection of Mat, a sacred truth that maintained the balance of the universe. An injunction against betraying one's tribe wasn't just a survival strategy. It was a sacred duty to one's ancestors and gods. By elevating laws to the realm of the sacred, these myths placed them beyond the realm of everyday debate or temptation. You wouldn't sell out a sacred value for a bag of silver, because to do so would be an existential violation of your identity, not just a calculated risk. This psychological insulation made legal adherence incredibly resilient. What emerges from this analysis is a stunning realization. The priests and kings of antiquity were pioneering behavioral scientists. Without the formal vocabulary of psychology, they possessed an intuitive, cultivated understanding of the human mind's levers and pulleys. They knew how to use story to condition responses, how to use awe to build loyalty, and how to use the sacred to create unwavering commitment. Their laboratory was the temple and the public square, and their data was the survival and cohesion of their civilizations for millennia. This ancient wisdom offers a crucial lesson for modern educators, leaders, and anyone who seeks to communicate important ideas. It reminds us that data and logic alone are often insufficient to drive meaningful change. To truly persuade and motivate, we must speak to the whole person, to their fears, their capacity for wonder, and their deep need to be part of something that transcends themselves. The most powerful rules, it seems, are not just written in books, but etched into the human heart through the timeless and psychologically profound power of a story well told. Yet for all the meticulous engineering of fear and awe, ancient myth-based legal systems were never monolithic forces that crushed the human spirit entirely. A closer look reveals a fascinating undercurrent of resistance, a testament to the enduring human capacity for critical thought and dissent, even in the face of supposedly divine authority. The very pantheons that enforced these laws often contained built-in loopholes in the form of trickster gods, archetypal figures who embodied chaos, cleverness, and a healthy disregard for the established order. These characters served as a crucial psychological pressure valve, allowing communities to explore the boundaries of their own beliefs, and at times openly questioned the justice of their divine rulers. Consider the complex figure of Loki in Norse mythology. Far more than a simple villain, Loki is a shapeshifter, a boundary crosser, and the agent of unpredictable change. While his actions often lead to calamity, particularly with the triggering of Ragnarok, many of his stories involve challenging the stuffy arrogance and hypocrisy of the other gods. He publicly mocks them for their flaws, undermines their solemn oaths, and exposes their pretensions. For a Norse listener, tales of Loki's mischief provided a sanctioned space to laugh at the powers that be, to acknowledge that the gods themselves were not always paragons of virtue or fairness. This narrative thread subtly suggested that blind obedience was not the only option, and that even divine authority could be questioned, mocked, and sometimes even outwitted. He was the embodiment of the what if, a reminder that the cosmic rules were not necessarily as fixed as they seemed. Similarly, in Greek tradition, the Titan Prometheus stands as a monumental figure of benevolent resistance against unjust divine authority. His crime was not malice, but an overwhelming compassion for humanity. He defied the direct command of Zeus by stealing fire from the gods and gifting it to mortals, bringing them knowledge, technology, and civilization. His subsequent punishment, being chained to a rock for an eagle to eternally devour his liver, is one of the most horrifying images in mythology. But his story is not one of simple deterrence. It is a tragic epic that forces a difficult question. Is it wrong to disobey an authority that is itself withholding a fundamental good? Prometheus became a powerful symbol of intellectual rebellion and self-sacrifice for the benefit of humankind. His myth validated the idea that some laws, even those decreed by the king of the gods, could be so unjust that defiance became a moral imperative. He represented the spark of critical thinking that could not be extinguished, even by eternal torture. Beyond the realm of myth, we find evidence of real-world pushback recorded in historical fragments. There are accounts from ancient Mesopotamia of citizens bringing lawsuits against corrupt officials, appealing over their heads to the king for a justice that the local system had failed to provide. In these cases, the framework of divine law was not rejected outright. Instead, it was wielded by the powerless against the powerful, a reminder that the ideals of Shamash were supposed to apply to everyone equally. Even in highly stratified Egypt, there are texts like The Eloquent Peasant, a story about a common farmer who, after being robbed by a greedy official, delivers a series of brilliant and impassioned speeches on the nature of true justice and Maat. He argues that Maat is not merely the preservation of the status quo, but requires active righteousness from those in power. This narrative celebrated the agency of the lowliest individual to hold the system accountable to its own highest ideals, suggesting that the emotional engineering of awe could be turned back upon the state itself. These acts and stories of resistance are profoundly important because they reveal the limits of control through narrative. They demonstrate that ancient peoples were not passive recipients of cultural programming but active, critical participants in their own legal and moral universes. The presence of trickster myths implies a deep self-awareness within these cultures and understanding that any system, no matter how divinely framed, could become corrupt, self-serving, or stagnant, and therefore needed a built-in mechanism for critique. The emotional engineering of fear and awe was a powerful tool, but it was not an all-powerful one. It could be short-circuited by laughter at a trickster's joke, undermined by sympathy for a tortured titan, or challenged by the eloquent appeal of a peasant demanding that his rulers simply live up to their own proclaimed values. This historical reality carries a crucial lesson for us today. It reminds us that the legitimacy of any legal system, ancient or modern, cannot rest solely on its ability to inspire awe or fear through compelling stories. Ultimately, that legitimacy must be earned through a demonstrable commitment to fairness, proportionality, and justice for all, not just for the powerful. A system that relies too heavily on emotional manipulation without this underlying fairness will inevitably breed its own Prometheuses and Loki's voices of dissent that expose its contradictions and demand something better. The long-term stability of law depends not on perfect control, but on maintaining a genuine covenant of trust with the people it governs, a covenant that can withstand questioning and allows for the possibility of its own improvement. Language itself became the most precise instrument in the ancient lawgiver's toolkit, a finely tuned device for sculpting emotional responses and etching legal principles directly into the collective memory. This was not the dry, technical language of modern legal contracts, but a rich, poetic, and deeply sensory form of storytelling. By weaving metaphors, rhythmic patterns, and vivid imagery into the fabric of their laws, ancient cultures transformed abstract rules into visceral experiences. The goal was to make the law unforgettable, to ensure that its lessons resonated not just in the mind but in the gut, compelling compliance through the sheer power of evocative speech. Consider the auditory hammering of repetitive phrases and alliteration, techniques that predate writing and were essential for oral tradition. A law recited aloud that used a consistent chant-like refrain was infinitely easier to remember. In Norse legal traditions, the laws themselves were known as kennings, metaphorical phrases that encapsulated complex ideas. A ruler wasn't just a king, he was a breaker of rings or a feeder of ravens, poetic titles that conjured images of generosity to his followers and deadly power to his enemies. This linguistic artistry made the law more than a set of instructions. It became a part of the cultural poetry, something to be recited and remembered with the same ease as a beloved epic. The rhythm and sound of the words themselves carried an emotional weight, making the legal concepts they described feel timeless, rhythmic, and inherently true, like the beating of a heart or the turning of the seasons. But the true masterstroke was the deployment of metaphor, a device that bridges the gap between the known and the unknown by linking a complex idea to a simple, powerful image. The biblical legal codes are a treasure trove of this technique. To deter disobedience, prophets didn't just threaten punishment. They spoke in terrifying, unforgettable metaphors of fire and brimstone, a phrase that evokes the suffocating smell of sulfur and the agonizing pain of burning flesh. This made the consequence of breaking a covenant feel immediate and horrifyingly tangible. Conversely, to inspire hope and loyalty, they promised a land flowing with milk and honey. This wasn't just a geographical location. It was a metaphor for abundance, security, and divine favor, a sensory image of sweet taste and nourishing comfort that created a powerful longing to be worthy of such a reward. These metaphors engineered specific emotions, a dread of searing pain and a profound awe for a paradise earned through obedience. This ancient understanding that language shapes reality is not a relic of the past, it is the bedrock of modern legal discourse. We are surrounded by the ghosts of these old metaphors, which continue to subconsciously steer public perception and policy. When we speak of a war on crime, we are not declaring a literal military conflict. We are invoking a powerful metaphor that frames criminal activity as an enemy to be vanquished, which in turn justifies a certain set of responses: increased policing, harsher sentences, and a societal mindset of us versus them. This linguistic frame generates fear and rallies support for aggressive policies, much like ancient myths of chaos monsters justified a king's absolute power. Similarly, the concept of blind justice is a potent metaphor inherited directly from the goddess Themis. Her blindfold is a brilliant symbol that does immense conceptual work. It represents the aspiration that justice should be impartial, unbiased, and unaffected by a person's wealth, status, or identity. This metaphor inspires awe for a system that strives for perfect fairness. Yet it also contains an inherent tension, as the blindness can metaphorically suggest a failure to see the nuanced social contexts and systemic inequalities that bring people before the law. Another enduring metaphor is that of the body politic, which envisions the state as a human body. The king or government is the head, the citizens are the limbs, and disease or disorder in any part threatens the health of the whole. This metaphor, used since ancient times, engineers a feeling of collective responsibility and awe for the intricate, organic nature of society, making the health of the legal system feel synonymous with the health of one's own body. The enduring power of this linguistic engineering lies in its ability to make the abstract concrete and the bureaucratic intimate. A legal statute about due process is one thing. The enduring image of Lady Justice with her scales is another. The first is understood, the second is felt. Ancient storytellers and lawmakers knew that to govern effectively, they had to first captivate the imagination, and there is no more direct path to the human imagination than through the careful, deliberate, and artistic use of language. They crafted stories that were not just heard but experienced, ensuring that the law lived not in scrolls alone, but in the very words, rhythms, and metaphors that people used to understand their world and their place within it. At the very heart of these intricate systems of myth and law lay a profound and ambitious project to define the very essence of justice itself, not as a human invention, but as a fundamental, unchangeable force woven into the fabric of the cosmos. This was emotional engineering's ultimate goal, to make a society's specific concept of right and wrong feel as inevitable and awe-inspiring as the rising sun or the turning of the seasons. By linking their legal codes to divine will and cosmic order, ancient leaders elevated their laws from mere rules for communal living to sacred, absolute truths. This connection transformed justice into something transcendent. It was no longer a matter for debate in the town square, but a principle to be discovered and revered, a thread in a magnificent divine tapestry that gave meaning and structure to all of existence. To question the law, then, was not just to disagree with a chieftain or a council of elders. It was to challenge the universe itself, an act of hubris that risked plunging the world back into primordial chaos. This sacred framing bestowed an incredible power and resilience upon these legal systems, but it also created a profound and often troubling paradox. The very same mechanism that made ideals of fairness and balance feel absolute and unchallengeable could also be used to sanctify and perpetuate glaring social injustices, making them appear natural, necessary, and God-given. The rigid caste system described in ancient Indian texts like the Rig Veda provides a powerful example. The allegory of the Purusha, the cosmic being whose body parts gave rise to the different varnas, wasn't presented as a convenient social theory. It was a creation myth, a story explaining the very origin of humanity. According to this narrative, priests emerged from the being's mouth, warriors from his arms, merchants from his thighs, and laborers from his feet. This was a breathtakingly effective piece of emotional engineering. It didn't just create a social hierarchy, it explained it through a lens of awe-inspiring cosmic biology. Your position in life wasn't an accident of birth or a result of social inequality. It was your preordained role, your sacred duty assigned by the gods at the dawn of time. To strive against your station wasn't just socially discouraged. It was a spiritual transgression, a violation of the divine plan that maintained the balance of the entire world. The awe intended for the cosmic order thus became a powerful tool for maintaining a deeply unequal status quo, making reform seem not only impossible but blasphemous. We see this same pattern echoed in the myths that reinforced gender roles across the ancient world. The Greek poet Hesiod's tale of Pandora, the first woman created by the gods as a punishment for mankind, is a stark illustration. Pandora was crafted from earth and water and endowed with irresistible beauty and charm, but she was also given a jar containing all the evils of the world: sickness, toil, and sorrow. Driven by her innate curiosity, she opened the jar, unleashing these plagues upon humanity forever, leaving only hope trapped inside. This story is far more than an entertaining fable. It is a foundational myth that used fear and mistrust to define the role of women in society. It presented female nature as inherently deceptive and dangerous, a beautiful curse that brought suffering into an otherwise idyllic world. This narrative emotionally engineered a specific conception of justice regarding gender, that strict legal and social control over women was not oppression but a necessary and justified defense for the survival and stability of the entire community. The fear of chaos evoked by Pandora's story was used to legitimize laws that severely restricted women's autonomy, property rights, and legal standing, framing inequality as a tragic but essential price for cosmic order. This deep-seated tension between the ideal of justice and the reality of injustice, both sanctified by the same myths, forces us to confront a critical question about these ancient systems. Were they truly designed to create a fair and equitable society, or were they primarily sophisticated tools for social control, designed to protect the power of an elite by dressing up their privileges in the irresistible garments of divine right and cosmic inevitability? The answer is likely a complex blend of both. There is no doubt that concepts like Maat or the Mesopotamian ideal of fairness provided a real moral compass, a genuine awe for a balanced and harmonious world that benefited everyone. These ideals offered a powerful critique against arbitrary violence and raw tyranny, providing a standard even kings were expected to uphold. Yet, simultaneously, the selective application of these principles reveals their utility for those in power. It was justice for the pharaoh to live in unparalleled luxury because he was the guarantor of Maat. It was justice for the Babylonian noble to have a different monetary penalty than a commoner because the social order ordained by Shamash was part of the divine balance. The emotional engineering of awe made this hierarchy feel natural, while the engineering of fear of chaos, fear of divine wrath, fear of losing one's place in the afterlife, discouraged anyone from challenging it. This reflection on ancient systems holds up a mirror to our own modern conceptions of justice. It invites us to ask how much of our own legal ideals are shaped not by pure reason, but by deep-seated emotions and the stories we tell ourselves about fairness, deservedness, and the natural order of things. Are our own legal frameworks always designed for true equity, or do they sometimes use emotional language of national security, traditional values, or economic necessity to rationalize and perpetuate their own forms of embedded inequality, making them feel as inevitable and unchallengeable as the will of the gods seemed to our ancestors? Yet, even as the gods slowly receded from their thrones in the legal imagination, their departure did not signal the end of emotional engineering. It simply marked a transformation in its form and focus. The great philosophical minds of ancient Greece began to question the very foundations of myth-based law, planting the seeds for a seismic shift in how societies conceived of justice and authority. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle launched a powerful critique against the old stories, arguing that governance based on the whimsical and often immoral tales of the gods was fundamentally irrational and unstable. In his monumental work, The Republic, Plato didn't just tinker with the old system, he proposed a radical overhaul. He envisioned a society governed not by poets and priests reciting myths, but by philosopher kings rulers guided solely by pure reason and a knowledge of the eternal form of the good. For Plato, the shadowy stories of the cave were to be replaced by the clear, unchanging light of philosophical truth. This was a direct assault on the emotional core of traditional law. He sought to drain the legal system of its fear of divine monsters and its awe for capricious gods, replacing them with a cool, dispassionate pursuit of objective truth that he believed would lead to a far more just and stable society. Aristotle, while more pragmatic than his teacher, similarly championed reason as the proper foundation for law. In his Politics, he argued that law should be reason-free from passion, a deliberate contrast to the emotionally charged narratives of myth. He promoted the concept of the rule of law, not the rule of men or gods. This idea suggested that legal authority should reside in a set of rational, consistent principles applied equally to all, rather than in the charismatic storytelling of a leader who might manipulate emotions for their own ends. This philosophical revolution represented the first major attempt to desacralize the law, to strip it of its supernatural storytelling and rebuild it on a foundation of human logic and empirical observation. The goal was no longer to make people feel the law through awe and dread, but to help them understand it through rational discourse. Centuries later, the Enlightenment would amplify this secularizing trend into a global movement. Thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau systematically dismantled the doctrine of divine right, which had been the last great myth propping up monarchical power in Europe. In its place, they erected a new edifice of legitimacy built upon the concept of individual rights and the social contract. The authority of law, they argued, did not descend from heaven but ascended from the consent of the governed. The U.S. Constitution and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became the sacred texts of this new age, written by men, for men, and based on enumerated principles rather than divine revelation. This was the ultimate triumph of the rationalist project, a legal framework designed by logic and debate, intended to be interpreted by judges and scholars, not by priests deciphering omens. However, to believe that this march of reason completely eradicated the human need for emotionally resonant narratives would be to misunderstand our own psychology. The emotional engineering of law did not vanish. It simply evolved, finding new vessels to carry the ancient currents of fear and awe. The nation-state itself became the new god, and nationalism the new religion. Stirring national myths replaced stories of divine creation. The founding fathers became secular saints, and documents like the Constitution became reliquaries of national identity, treated with a reverence once reserved for holy scriptures. The emotional awe once directed at Zeus or Osiris was now channeled toward the flag, the founding documents, and the abstract ideal of the nation. These stories fostered a powerful sense of belonging and loyalty, creating an emotional bond to the legal system that was just as potent as the old religious devotion. Furthermore, the rise of mass media in the 20th and 21st centuries created a new pantheon of storytellers with unprecedented power to shape legal attitudes. News media, film, and television took over the role of the ancient skalds and priests, crafting modern cautionary tales and hero narratives. High-profile trials are broadcast into our homes like dramatic rituals, with the courtroom serving as the new temple of justice. Prosecutors and defense attorneys weave emotional narratives for the jury, painting defendants as monsters to be feared or victims to be pitied. Political campaigns expertly deploy fear of the other, the criminal, the immigrant, the radical, to rally support for tougher laws and policies, while inspiring awe for an idealized past that must be protected. The tools have changed from epic poems to evening news segments and social media campaigns, but the underlying psychological mechanisms of narrative persuasion remain strikingly familiar. We are still being guided by stories, still having our legal emotions engineered, not by myths about the underworld, but by narratives about economic collapse, societal decay, or national destiny. This enduring power of story confirms that while we may have traded the pantheon of Olympus for the podium of the press conference, The human heart still responds most powerfully to lore when it is wrapped in a compelling tale. So as we reflect on this vast legacy stretching from ancient Mesopotamia to the modern courthouse, we are left with a powerful challenge and a crucial responsibility. The emotional engineering of fear and awe is not a relic we have outgrown. It is a fundamental tool of human social organization that we have simply repurposed. The critical question for us today is not whether we will use stories and symbols to shape legal attitudes, because we always will, but how we can wield this incredible power with wisdom, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. We must strive to build legal systems whose stories inspire awe not for blind authority, but for the breathtaking ideal of equal justice under law. We must craft narratives that generate a healthy fear not of divine monsters, but of the very real, corrosive damage caused by injustice, corruption, and the abuse of power. Our modern myths, whether told in the media, the classroom, or the political arena, should be designed to expand empathy rather than restrict it, to build bridges instead of walls, and to highlight our shared humanity rather than our divisions. The ancient world teaches us that law is far more than a dry set of rules. It is the story a society tells about itself, its values, and its dreams for the future. It is a living narrative that lives in our hearts as much as in our statute books. Let us ensure that the stories we choose to tell, the symbols we revere, the histories we celebrate, and the values we instill through our legal institutions are worthy of the most just, compassionate, and equitable world we hope to build. For in the end, the most profound power of the law has never been its ability to punish, but its capacity to inspire us to become better versions of ourselves together. If this journey into the ancient crossroads of myth and law has sparked your curiosity, we would love to hear your perspective down in the comments. How do you see these old techniques of emotional storytelling showing up in our modern world? Perhaps in the way a high-profile trial is covered in the news, or in the powerful symbols we still use to represent justice. Your insights are what turn a video into a conversation, so please share your thoughts and let's discuss. If you enjoyed this deep dive, showing your support with a like really helps share these ideas with a wider audience. And subscribing is your ticket to a whole library of explorations into history's greatest puzzles and legends. Make sure to tap that bell icon too, so you never miss out on our next adventure into the past. And finally, be sure to let us know what other hidden stories you'd like us to unravel next. Your suggestions often become our most compelling videos. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep wondering.